A millennia ago, nobody thought it was possible to start a galactic war with one single word. Yesterday, nobody thought it was possible for one word to end it. Today, I have to grapple with the weight of the fact that both events, however unlikely, have undeniably happened. It all began in the first century of my nation's stellar age, the period of galactic infancy when one's kind first steps out on primitive vessels to explore and claim the stars, on a then insignificant world called Trenelia. It had just been liberated from the clutches of the Azravek regime, which had allegedly engaged in a campaign of genocide against the Trenelian people, and it was forced by law to entertain an ambassador whose sole purpose was to deny those allegations. Naturally, one can assume the Trenelians didn't take that kindly. One of the refugees, a particularly important one, who had actually led the armed uprising that repulsed their Azravek occupiers, demanded from her guest that he acknowledge the crimes against sapients that her people had suffered. He didn't even bother to deny it. I was born a millennium after that happened, and on a planet millions of light years away from where the first shot was fired, and yet, I remember it as if I was in that very room. First, the Azravek ambassador flicked a tentacle dismissively. Then he puffed out his leathery chest. Then he turned the most baleful gaze imaginable on his Trenelian host, and he told her no. Naturally, she responded by pulling out an energy pistol and shooting him as many times as her flimsy digits could squeeze the trigger. So sure was her gaze and so true was her aim that I think, even if she knew all the destruction and death her one act of anger would cause, she would have drawn that gun all the same. That was the first shot of the Great Galactic War. 1,000 years would pass until somebody was blessed enough to fire the last. The regime was quick to order a crackdown after their ambassador's death, and they began an intensive investigation into the security breaches that allowed it in the first place. One thing led to another, and as the dots were connected and an image of the responsible party formed, regime battleships invaded foreign space to demand answers for the murder of their official. Again, nobody knows whether any of the nations attacked were responsible for this act. All we know is that they did not take this invasion lying down. The regime attempted to force their capitulation, and it failed. Then, with their incursion being ground to a halt by the force of all these enemies, they called upon allies to bring them aid. For 2 centuries, small conflicts just like this had threatened to destabilize the explosive keg that was the Milky Way galaxy. For 2 centuries, its inhabitants had gotten lucky time and time again as cooler heads prevailed and the galaxy was saved from outright war. This time, their luck did not last. The conflict snowballed into a war involving even the galaxy's great powers. Within decades, battle lines had already been drawn as old rivalries broke out into violence. This is where the Great Galactic War truly became galactic, and where my homeland, the United Reslian Worlds, finally came into play. Now, though this may come as a surprise to some, having a century and a half of spacefaring to fall back on did not make us significant in the grand scheme of things. There are more stars in the sky today than there were Reslians on the day we joined the war. The galaxy is vast, unspeakably vast, and even the grandest empire I can realistically imagine is dwarfed many times over by the sheer size of it. Only the elder powers, nations that had been colonizing new worlds since before my kind had developed the steam engine, were significant at all in this conflict. Even then, they made little difference individually. To the fathers of fallen sons and the sons of fallen fathers, it makes no difference whether our role in the war was significant. I speak from a place of experience when I say this. So despite the United Worlds' significance in the galactic conflict as a whole, I am very proud to say that my people did their part. I even have a genetic record from 1,000 years prior that says one of my distant family members was the first Reslian to be killed in action. Strange as it may be, I feel a sense of morbid pride about that. From the day we were called on to serve to the day we laid down our weapons, the Reslian people took eagerly to the cause of our allies. Reslian troops eagerly served on every front available, and though I confess my Reslian brethren were no more competent or victorious than any other race at the time, I feel it is entirely understandable when I say I feel greater pride in the actions of my small nation than in the noblest deeds of any other power. Reslia, in no other world, shall always remain my home. My nation stood apart from most others in that our allegiance stayed true throughout the entire conflict. The League of Core Powers, the faction to which we lent our strength, lost and gained many members over the course of the war. The United Reslian Worlds, I am proud to say, chose their side only once. There were three main factions of the conflict as I remember them. The League of Core Powers, which, as you may expect, was comprised of nations primarily from the galactic core, was the alliance my ancestors fought and died for. Its primary adversary, the Rim Alliance, surrounded it on all sides and controlled most of the outer galaxy. All those powers that did not wish to choose a side became part of a faction that Reslian tacticians designated the Unaligned Powers. A bit of a dull name, I admit. But it fit the bill. That list of nations grew smaller by the day as political, economic, or even military pressure forced them to choose a side. Many chose ours. Many did not. There are very few constants to the Great Galactic War. Battle lines shifted repeatedly. Nations swapped sides as they pleased. Weapons and tactics underwent constant evolution, as did the defenses employed to counter them. The Reslian military's most modern equipment became obsolete within decades of our first engagement. Then we made new equipment to compensate, called that our most modern set, and watched as the same thing happened as the pace of conflict passed us by. That's actually one of the few things I'm not proud of about us. There are very few constants to warfare at all, in fact. But the one thing they all have in common may be the most beautiful part of conflict at all. Every war must have an end. And this one's was so simple, I'm surprised I didn't think of it first. It all began when the Rim Alliance discovered a single C-type star with 8 planetary bodies locked in various orbits around it. One proved to be habitable, boasting a primarily oxygen-nitrogen atmosphere and a primitive civilization in the early space age. And the Alliance delayed a few years before one of its nations actually sent an expedition out to claim this world for themselves. As I stated earlier, there is no standard protocol for anything during this time period. Even today, when the guns have finally fallen silent, our two sides can't even agree on what should be considered and prosecuted as a war crime. That in and of itself threatens to start this conflict anew. So, since there is no standardization for anything, the Alliance and League both left small decisions like uplifting primitives to the nations that make them up. If the party that first made contact with those primitives was intent on destroying or subjugating them, as too many were, I think I would still be on the Galactic War's front lines. Thankfully, these particular space-age simians were contacted by a merciful species called the Troleskis. They specialized in field medicine, the treatment of wounded, and the distribution of aid to those affected by the war. I have great respect for people who can maintain their virtues, even in a time of evil. The Troleskis are no exception. They performed a standard first contact, by their standards, and donated a cache of their knowledge to the Rim Alliance archive on Taraski V. They say it's the original galactic archive from before the war, but we say the same thing about ours, so I really don't know who to believe. I personally think the real archive was destroyed in the conflict. Real or fake, however, the Rim Alliance archive and its curator's generosity is probably the only reason I, or anyone in the League of Core Powers, knows any sort of detail about these primitive creatures. They call themselves human, four-limbed, nearly hairless apes that possess no unusual qualities besides a set of intricate swirls on their fingers and a knack for asking the questions everybody else is too busy fighting to consider. That alone makes them remarkable. Humans hail from a bog-standard, insignificant speck of a planet called Earth, and they seem to be utterly and completely average in comparison with the races of the galaxy, like Reslians in a way. In fact, the only relevant thing that sets humans apart from any other species in the galaxy is that they were the ones to end the Great Galactic War. And all it took them was one single word. My claim to fame is that I was the first one lucky enough to hear that word spoken. It first began on a backwater planet called Atroci II, second world from the star known as Atroci. where I and my company were sent as a part of an assault meant to wrest several mineral refining outposts from the claws of the Troleskis. Now, because of what I have said previously about the Troleskis being a kind and empathetic species, it might be correct to assume that they were also relatively pacifist. Let me say clearly now that this preconception couldn't be further from the truth. We faced heavy resistance on every stage of the invasion. The Reslian Space Navy suffered heavy casualties during their attempt to force the planet's naval garrison out of orbit. Our first two attempts were repulsed with significant losses. Only our third attack against a substantially weakened defense formation was able to beat the Troleski fleet back and decimate their orbital batteries. With orbital bombardment unfeasible due to the planetary garrison's formidable energy shields, the next realistic move was to land ground troops and attempt to take the objectives with planetary fighting. That is precisely what we did. First, we attempted to land orbital drop troopers just outside the shield perimeters and seize them rapidly in a lightning assault. The United Reslian Marine Corps was specialized in precisely such incursions. They were repulsed every time they tried. The Troleski air defenses were incredible. The Reslian military had never faced Troleski soldiers before this, only their medics or aid personnel, and any confidence we had in an easy victory vanished as soon as we met them in combat. By now, we were well aware the Troleski military was not to be trifled with. And this is where I come in. When all hope of a quick, victorious orbital incursion was lost, the standard military procedure was to send in the Reslian army and prepare for the long, costly slog of trench warfare. My unit, the 7,821st C Cohort, was one of the units selected to take the planet. As the name suggests, we were a company of about 2,000 soldiers trained in amphibious landings and backed by a squadron of 12 sea-going warships. Our objective was to take the planetary capital without significant damage to its refining facility, secure it against any Troleski counterattack, and use it as a base of operations to press forward into the other major cities. We landed our ships outside the flak battery's range and began our offensive immediately. I, being by far the most senior officer of the cohort, had been given command. Our offensive was met with massive, though costly, success. Anti-ship missiles struck 11 of my 12 warships and 7 armored landing craft, in spite of our advanced point defense batteries. And I lost 4 ships as we pushed through a strait toward the capital. I had to land troops 3 times to disable anti-ship emplacements manually, deeming it too risky to engage them with my naval assets, and I lost almost a tenth of my cohort in such incursions before even reaching the capital. Once there, the resistance was even fiercer. The anti-ship fire was too intense for my warships to soften up the ground defenses as planned, and heavy ordnance was forbidden because we needed the capital's industry intact. This left me paralyzed. I could land troops just fine. The landing craft were durable enough, but my responsibility to the soldiers under my command was even greater than my duty to Reslia. I did not want to send my troops into a meat grinder. I had been promised close air support as the planetary shields ended high enough to allow for atmospheric skimmers to fly under them, but the Troleski air defenses were stronger than anticipated. I delayed, asking for more reinforcements. My request was denied. The order came through to land on that beach, and I, like a coward, sent almost 2,000 men and women to die while I watched from the safety of my flagship. That's the thing I hate most about war. It's too impersonal. It's easy to bomb a hospital when you never meet the patients. Easy to send men to die when you never have to see it happen. If every general and every politician had to see the light fade from a dying soldier's eyes, they'd think long and hard over starting another war. My men took the capital in a day. Once we disabled their anti-ship emplacements and I could bring my warships in close, it was practically a walk under rainbows. Street-to-street combat is very one-sided when one of the parties has access to precision missile strikes and the other doesn't. The Troleskis withdrew before I could demonstrate that fact. The hardest part by far, however, was taking the initial beachhead. Even with our amphibious tanks, which can operate over water as well as on land, it was severely costly. 1,000 Reslian army soldiers died. I understand that there is nothing I could have done to save their lives. It helps only a little. It was just after taking the city when my cohort was first establishing fortifications and waiting on those reinforcements we were promised would arrive when I met my first human. He was a prisoner, a soldier on the Treleski side of the conflict, and not very notable in status or prestige. In fact, I only decided to speak to the man because he was a human, and I had never actually seen a human before. I've always been amenable to meeting new types of people. I have a recording of my conversation with the human saved in both my personal and military files. I watch it often. It's hard to believe such a small event as an interrogation could be so significant in the long run. Even without the recordings, however, I think I would still have been able to remember what was said. I think everybody can. The interrogation room was dull, dark, and damp, the 3Ds that the Reslian army prioritized when choosing where to interrogate its prisoners. I had cells on my ship, but the prisoner was already being kept in the basement of an abandoned house, and I didn't feel the need to move him just yet. Besides, the basement worked fine for my purposes. The human looked exactly how they did in the holovids. I don't know why I was expecting something different. Maybe it's because I haven't seen that many holovids of them. I don't really know why, but it's rare to see a human in the military. Most uplifted species took eagerly to the war, whether by choice or duty. But humans were derelict in their duty to serve. I elected to probe him based on that. Name and rank? I asked. It was standard procedure, and I didn't deviate from it. The human stayed silent. Name and rank. I spoke louder this time. Still, no answer. Do you intend to speak to me at all? I snapped. I was no interrogator, and thus utterly unprepared for my prisoner's silence. You can't stay silent forever, I told him. You're a social animal. Communication is an instinct for your species. He sat there in silence for what must have been several hours. The security recording has the exact time, but I forgot what it says. Either way, it doesn't matter. After I spent enough time waiting him out, he looked up at me and mumbled, Damn, you really don't have anything better to do? As if I would still be here if I did. I do not, I told him. Humans are a rare sight in the military. I simply wanted to know why you ended up here, nothing more. While I was interested in humanity's dereliction of military duty, it had little to do with the current conversation. Building a sense of friendship with a prisoner was key if one wanted to extract secrets from them. Reslian army psychologists were analyzing every word of this interrogation in the utmost detail. Me? It was either doing military service or working at a fucking McDonald's, and I'm not working at a fucking McDonald's. The human smiled. I had studied them enough to remember that expression typically meant something good in them. You're a mercenary, then, I assumed. I didn't care for soldiers of fortune like him, who fought out of such petty obligations as money or prestige. The pride people felt in serving their country should be the only thing that called anyone to the battlefield. If you're purely in this for selfish reasons, then I really think you should have just taken the job at McDonald's. A bit risky if I wanted to build a rapport, but I didn't think I'd end up being the one to crack secrets from him. My cohort had specialized interrogation teams for that. Though, given the fierce resistance I'd encountered thus far, I wouldn't have been surprised if my men failed to crack him. War is no place for you. Shit, there's a fucking understatement, the human said. He tried to wave his arms, but they were still cuffed behind his back. Hey, can you, He strained against his handcuffs again. You know. I considered it. In the end, the benefits far outweighed the downsides. I was more physically imposing than him by a significant margin, severely diminishing his likelihood of attempting to overpower me. And I was also completely unarmed. Even if he were trained in special skills that could allow him to overpower one adult Reslian, the trio of guards just behind the interrogation room's door would make mincemeat of him with their pulse shotguns. If you insist. I tapped a control to unlock his handcuffs. It was beneficial to establish myself as a friendly presence, as I had stated earlier, and giving him even superficial freedoms helped with that. I personally disliked the man. Why did you enlist? He asked me. I seriously doubted he'd understand. As far as I could tell at the moment, humans had a very warped concept of duty to a higher power. From what I had heard of them, mostly military information, humans seemed like a species of spineless cowards, No Reslian would have ever been caught so lacking in military contribution. In my nation, everyone did their part. Duty, I said. Duty to my nation. Duty to the League of Core Powers. Duty to my comrades and the people I defend at home. I hesitated for a moment. I was unsure what would be the right way to proceed. Though I had not yet gotten to the topic of military secrets, I had to remember that this was a military interrogation. I was not here to impress upon a mercenary the concept of duty to a power that was more than just his wallet. It's rare to see a human in the military, I finally said. I had found a way to proceed that, though it may not have been the best, would at least answer a question I very much wanted to know. Most people in the galaxy contribute everything they have to the war effort, to the defense of their homes and their families, but humans seem different. Why? Because we're not fucking idiots, the human said. I felt slightly offended by that. You must really want to continue this war, huh? To that, I took great offense. I want to win the war, I corrected him. You must surely feel the same. That was when the word was first spoken. The one word that made the guns fall silent, that made the soldiers return home, that made the dying finally end. The one word everybody was too focused on the war to ever bother asking. Why? I hesitated at that. Why did I want to win the war? I had no hatred for the Treleskis. Of course, the Rim Alliance had many nations that I loathed and despised, but I could say the same for my own league as well. Alliance with them had been taken by the Reslian worlds as simply a necessary evil. It's my duty, I finally settled on. The United Reslian worlds demand it of me. Shit, man. You know people are dying, right? The human asked. I knew that fact better than most. I don't mean to be insensitive to the soldiers who fell in combat, but it seems to me that it's my duty is a really shitty thing to die for. Where I'm from, people fight for a cause that's worth fighting, and this one really isn't. I took a step back. Shock was clearly written across my features. I had always considered duty something worth fighting for, dying for, even. I wanted peace as much as anyone else, but it was not my responsibility to make that call. It's not our responsibility to decide what war is or isn't worth fighting. We're soldiers. We receive orders and we obey. I looked down on my prisoner, literally and figuratively. He was a mercenary who enlisted solely for the sake of a steady job. What did he know about the duty to serve? That is duty. Pure and simple. Not our responsibility, he gasped, in awe at my stupidity. We're the ones who have to risk our lives. Why the hell would we do this if we didn't see a reason to do it? By this point, I was clearly exasperated. Because it is our duty, I stated firmly. It was the answer I'd been told to give, the statement I'd been told to believe, and I still did wholeheartedly believe it. But just as it was a soldier's duty to fight in the politicians' wars, it was the politicians' duty to make certain those wars were worth fighting. I considered debating my prisoner further, but I remembered my objective. I was a soldier first, and a kind man second. Then, realizing that I was losing track of my objective and severely doubting that I'd ply any secrets from this pitiable mercenary, I turned abruptly to leave. Look at the gravestones, the mercenary called after me. Look at the graves of your soldiers and ask yourselves what they died for. I left the room and closed the door behind me, carrying a new burden on my shoulders. Truth be told, I did not know why it was my duty to fight this war. The United Worlds gained little in terms of territory and resources, and all the plunder we did find was put straight back into the ever-toiling factories of the war effort. The Reslian people, which had once been so lucky as to never know poverty or hunger, were suffering under the increasing weight of the wartime economy. And for what? I could not think of any reason to hate the Rim Alliance. Any way the galaxy would be better off if they were conquered or forced to capitulate. At the time, I was not even sure why this conflict started. I looked it up. I went straight to the least bombed archive I could find and demanded the archivist give me the information. It turns out that they weren't entirely sure either. Neither was Reslian Army Command, who acted very dismissively about my request to know just why I was sending men to die. I believed in my country as much as any other Reslian. I still do, actually. But the knowledge that I was sacrificing lives out of blind patriotism gnawed at me like a rabid animal. When the 897th Land Cohort arrived to reinforce my position, with over 4,000 able-bodied soldiers and more heavy tanks than a dozen sea cohorts, I took a brief and very terrible risk by marching directly up to my commanding officer and asking him just why we were fighting this war. "It's our duty, son," was just about the only answer I got. I could not argue with it. It was our duty. All doubts about my mission aside, I was determined to see this war through as an honorable and disciplined Reslian officer. I never once violated military law or became derelict in my duties during my quest to understand just why I and my men were fighting. What I did do, however, was make inquiries, very persistent, very probing inquiries, leveraging the full respect and prestige my rank in the United Reslian Army afforded me. In the end, I got my answer. A friend at the United Reslian Archive spoke to a friend at the League of Core Powers Archive and got me a fully detailed transcript of the exact details of the beginning of this war. The assassination of an Azravik regime ambassador, as I stated earlier. This was not a poor reason to fight, I reasoned. Vengeance, whether for a genocide or an assassination, was a very understandable cause to take up arms for. If the United Reslian Worlds had any qualms about fighting in this war, we would surely have stopped long ago. Then the second report came in. Both the Azravik regime and the Trinellians they were fighting were no longer around to settle their differences. In fact, they and most of the original parties to their conflict had been destroyed within centuries of its beginning. Nobody was even sure which sides they had originally belonged to, or if they had picked a side at all. This seemed odd to me. I spoke to the prisoner from earlier and told him what I had found. "So why the fuck are you still fighting?" was the first thing he asked. Predictable. "The people who started this war are 1,000 years dead and buried. What duty makes you march into the gears of a machine that has no reason left to run?" I remained silent. I did not know that fact myself. "I don't know," I admitted. "But I have faith in my leaders. You should have more faith in yours." "Why?" the prisoner asked. "If you want to have faith, that's fine by me. But if you have any doubt at all that you're not just wasting men in a meat grinder, you walk right up to your leader and ask him why you're still fighting." Normally, I would not have tolerated such an insult to the United Reslian World's trusted leadership. I don't know if the carnage of the war had made me soft or if I simply felt it was my duty to my soldiers. But not only did I forgive that statement, I even began to question my own leadership. My commitment to my duty forbade me from disobeying a lawful order, and I never once felt the compulsion to do so. But there was nothing stopping me from questioning my leadership. Nothing stopped me from asking why this war was being fought. And after I had won enough prestige in battle and pestered my leaders enough with inquiries, they looked into it. An alliance, apparently, was the thing that first began this conflict. A contract nearly 900 years old. Most of the nations that now fought did not exist when it was first signed. And though I was not there to see it, my inquiry created ripples. Like a stone being dropped into a placid pond, my questioning voice was enough to break the silence behind this conflict. People at the highest ranks of Reslian power began to wonder just why we were still fighting. And, as casualty numbers ticked ever higher, and the Reslian people suffered under further constraints, they failed repeatedly to find a proper answer. It took 3 short years for my efforts to bring peace to Reslia. I was never celebrated, nor was my human prisoner who began this whole affair. But neither of us had any wish to be. It was enough to see peace in our time, if only in this tiny patch of space. Of course, it did not stay contained for long. The First Galactic Peace was, in a way, much like the Great Galactic War. All it needed was a single catalyst. First, our close allies contacted us. They began to wonder why we had dropped out of the war effort. We asked them why they still remained fighting. They had their answers, as we all did. But as time went on, and the United Reslian Worlds became prosperous once more, the nations surrounding us began to wonder if those reasons were enough. Soon, the League of Core Powers was fracturing because its millions of members, controlling billions of worlds, were simply losing their will to keep fighting. The Rim Alliance was next. Its collapse was much faster. The human race had already been at work there, laboring hard to bring an end to what they viewed as a pointless conflict, and their efforts had borne such fruit that even if I had discarded everything I was told by my prisoner, the Alliance would likely have collapsed within the next decade anyway. As it was now, with their only enemy dissolving as nations dropped out of the fight, they did not last very long either. A miracle had finally happened. The Great Galactic War was over. Finally, it was over. Now the rebuilding began. The Reslian government labored long and hard to find the man responsible for peace, and the Supreme Senator herself came to visit me on my deathbed. By then I was an old man, far removed from the rigors of military service. Modern medicine had labored hard to sustain me these past few years, but I knew as well as any other that my time was fast approaching. That is why I am recording this message, actually. I told the Supreme Senator the name of the man responsible for peace, my human prisoner, and the one word he told me did more heavy lifting than I ever could. Tonight, I will watch from my hospital bed as he is honored at a ceremony on the capital world of Albari. I would have gone myself, but my medical condition has worsened to the point of making travel impossible. The doctors say I will not survive the week. I don't mind that at all. All my life, I have done my duty to the Reslian people and the Reslian state. I am recording this message for prosperity, because I believe there is some benefit in remembering history straight from the words of those who saw it happen. Tonight, my former prisoner will grasp the Supreme Senator's claw in front of all the worlds and receive the greatest honor my people can bestow. I do not think I will survive to see tomorrow. My final thing to do in this universe is to watch that man become honored among the nations of the galaxy, and then I may close my eyes and sleep the deep and dreamless sleep of an old soldier who has done his duty to the end.